Hey everyone, thanks for joining us again. This is Concord Days, and my name is Tammy Rose. Now, I'm a playwright who really loves to take quotes from the past and bring them into a modern context. And a few months ago, there was an article in the New Yorker that had a brilliant line. When Americans talk about nonviolent protest, they usually have in mind the spiritual lineage connecting Jesus to Thoreau and Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. Today, we're going to be talking about social justice and how Thoreau influenced it, and how he generally influenced the evolution of it through America, and how people are using him and his words. A lot of people will look to Civil Disobedience, the essay he wrote, as resistance to civil government, and his description of what it was like to be arrested in America. I have paid no poll tax for 6 years. I was put into jail once on this account for one night. And as I stood considering the walls of solid stone, 2 or 3 feet thick, the door of wood and iron, a foot thick, and the iron grating which strained the light, I could not help being struck with the foolishness of that institution which treated me as if I were mere flesh and blood and bones, to be locked up. As they could not reach me, they had resolved to punish my body, just as boys, if they cannot come at some person against whom they have a spite, will abuse his dog. I saw that the state was half-witted and that it did not know its friends from its foes. And I lost all my remaining respect for it, and I pitied it. Today we have people who are going to be well-versed in this conversation. And it's really a pleasure to invite both of you, Richard and Nikki, to join us. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Nikki Turpin. I am the programming director for the Robbins House, which is located in Concord, Massachusetts.
And
welcome, Nikki.
Welcome, Nikki. Thank you for having us, Tammy. My name is Richard Smith. I'm a Concord historian, and I specialize in Henry Thoreau, the Transcendentalists, abolitionism, and the Civil War. And, it's interesting because Thoreau has certainly become like the patron saint of civil disobedience. And Concord there were people doing civilly disobedient things in Concord before Thoreau. April 19th, 1775 was an act of civil disobedience. But Thoreau himself gets a lot of credit for it. Whether that's true or not, he certainly isn't the one that came up with the phrase civil disobedience. But in the summer of 1846, when he was living at Walden Pond, he was walking into town because he had a shoe at the cobbler's. Sam Staples was the constable and the jailer and the tax gatherer, and he stopped Henry because Henry had not paid his poll tax in a few years. Henry said that he wasn't going to pay it. Sam offered to pay it. I could pay it if you're hard up. And Henry said that it was the principle of the thing. And he said, well, Henry, if you do not pay your tax, sooner or later I'll have to lock you up. And Thoreau said, well, now's as good a time as any. So he spent the night in Concord jail, which he said was a, quote, novel and interesting experience. Someone paid the poll tax, and he was released the next morning. Because of that instance, several months later, actually more like a year later, when he was living at the Emerson House after he left Walden Pond, he wrote a lecture called The Relation of the Individual to the State, which was the first version of what we now know as civil disobedience. When it was published in 1849, it was called Resistance to Civil Government. It became known as Civil Disobedience when it was published in a compendium of his works in 1866. That's 4 years after he died We don't know who came up with the idea of calling it civil disobedience. I tend to think it was probably an editor at Ticknor and Fields, the publishers. I think they're the ones that came up with the title, because nowhere in any of Thoreau's writings does he ever use the term civil disobedience.
And can we go into what the meaning of the term poll tax is?
Oh, sure. The poll tax was, into the 20th century, a state tax. But more than that, it was more of a local tax. A poll tax was paid by all men of voting age. So in Thoreau's time, 21 years of age. And basically, it was a way for the state of Massachusetts to not only raise revenue, but it was a way to see how many voters there were in the state. So, and the money could be...
Was it also a way to stop people from voting?
In Massachusetts, not really, but in some of the southern states, absolutely. Absolutely, especially poor whites and poor blacks who could not raise money for a poll tax. It was absolutely a way to keep people from voting. You didn't really have that so much in Massachusetts that I know of. Right. But it was a local tax. The money would be used on local things, local, who knows, fixing roads or something like that. So ironically, Thoreau not paying the poll tax was not something that the federal government would have noticed. So, and we're talking about it. We're talking about $1.50. So, but
so what was he exactly protesting?
He was protesting. The idea
like the
is
Mexican-American War, like that's what we call it now.
So he said, and he was protesting slavery, but the poll tax in Massachusetts did not go for the war in Mexico or for capturing runaway slaves. But as Thoreau says in Civil Disobedience, it's kind of a moot point. He's protesting the fact that the money could go to buy a musket for the Mexican War. The money could go to help capture a fugitive slave. Concord supports Massachusetts. Massachusetts supports the federal government. The federal government supports the Mexican War and the fugitive slave laws. So for Thoreau, the idea is, even though that money is not directly going for those things, it's the act of not paying allegiance to the state. And the state could be Massachusetts, the state could be the federal government, but it's the act of not showing allegiance to the federal government in any way, shape, or form. He's a Garrisonian. William Lloyd Garrison, Thoreau's mom and sisters were founders of the Female Anti-Slavery Society. They followed William Lloyd Garrison. William Lloyd Garrison's motto was no union with slaveholders, meaning do not vote for anybody, do not pay any taxes. That way, you are not giving your allegiance to the federal government in any way, shape, or form. You are withdrawing your allegiance, as Thoreau would say, to the federal government. So that's why he did not pay his poll tax. There was no federal income tax at the time. All taxes were local at the time. There was highway taxes. Thoreau said, I'll pay the highway tax because I know where that money goes. And I'll pay my school taxes because I know where that money goes. The poll tax, I don't know where the money goes. So that's the background behind all of that.
Yeah, and it's I agree that the taxes can be sort of bundled up into things that even today, especially today, we don't really know where our tax money is going. And right. Back then, the Mexican-American War was essentially, a one-sided force of America kind of trying to bully Mexico into giving over what is now Texas. Right. And this whole idea of, manifest destiny and we just have to keep fighting. I can definitely understand how the government would be seen as this overarching power at the time, even as it is today.
Well, the abolitionists, especially in New England, were pretty hip to the fact that President Polk started the Mexican War so that he could obtain land to extend slavery into those new territories. And they were the only ones in America, people like William Lloyd Garrison and Wendell Phillips and Frederick Douglass and Thoreau and Emerson. They were all very aware that this was a war for conquest. And what are you going to do with those contested lands while expand slavery into those territories? And the abolitionists were screaming about that from almost the very beginning of the war in 1846. And most people ignored them. It was the first war in American history where a sizable part of the population was protesting that war. It was very popular in the South, of course. It was very popular in the Western states, like Kentucky and Tennessee. But all of the protest against the war came primarily from New England states. And the Massachusetts abolitionists were the loudest of all in protesting the war. And the people in Concord absolutely were against the war in any way, shape, and form. So Thoreau's not doing anything radically different than other abolitionists would have been doing in 1846. But he just happened to write a world-changing essay about it a few years later.
Yeah, and Nikki, I want to bring you into this conversation. What is your perspective of what's going on in America at the time?
Well, I was thinking about the quote that you just read, and it's so interesting because 3 out of the 4 men were assassinated for their beliefs, right? So Gandhi was shot and killed. Jesus was, if you believe, this story, was persecuted for standing up for others. And obviously Dr. King as well. And so to me, it's really interesting that the only person who survived being disobedient was a white male. Right?
Well, and you can also say that all 4 of them were in prison for their beliefs as well.
Right. And so they shared this commonality, but only 3 ended up dying for that belief. And so the voice that carries on is the one that lived. And so now he's got to fight by himself, right? But he's actually fighting for others. He's not just fighting for himself. And so it's a very different place of fighting, for lack of a better word, which is very different. It's not for oneself. And so in some ways it means probably more than when you're just fighting for yourself, because there is something at play. You have skin in the game, so to speak. But he didn't, and he was still fighting. So that was really interesting to me that those 4 people were like kind of compared.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think what's really important also is how different we think about what it means to stand up for what's right, opposed to what the authority wants, so to speak, and authority meaning government, right? And what's law versus practice. So like we look at Dr. King now and we elevate him and, have this idea of he was so great. But when you rewind and go into that moment when he actually existed, he was getting death threats. And so it's a very different place of understanding, right? Like we look at it as a value, right? Like he did all of these things and we place him rightfully so, as I say, on a pedestal. But in that moment, people weren't. People thought it was outrageous to do this. They thought it was outrageous to sit in. It was insane to boycott a bus company, right? Whereas we look now and most of us like, yeah, I can do that. Like how many of us this summer stopped buying from certain companies, right? Like stopped purchasing from certain corporations, or maybe not necessarily stopped, but like started using more Black owned businesses or more, mom and pop businesses to make purchases and waiting that extra week to get it delivered versus using Amazon. And so I think it's really interesting to see what we thought as crazy is no longer crazy. And I wonder, as we are, out of 2020, how we will look at the protests of this summer in 15 years and 20 years and say, well, they didn't really, that wasn't much to do. Like they did something, but it wasn't much, right? They didn't sacrifice more because now we're going to take it to the next level.
Right. And also like Colin Kaepernick, right? Yeah. So like he's kneeling down, while they're playing, the American national anthem. And that was like, he was vilified,
Right.
And like for showing like essentially a sign of respect, you know?
He lost his job, right? Like he was basically told he can't play anymore.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned him because, as soon as people started giving Kaepernick a lot of grief for what he was doing, I was immediately flashing back to Muhammad Ali, who basically he was stripped of his heavyweight title. He was blacklisted. There were threats
can you go into that? Yeah, go into that history a little bit because I really think it's fascinating. He was this amazing boxing champ, right? And he like had won the heavyweight titles of the world and stuff. And then and then Vietnam came along, right? So and he was drafted.
He won the heavyweight championship in 1964. He was still Cassius Clay at the time. Not too long after he won the title, he was introduced to the Nation of Islam, and he changed his name to Muhammad Ali, which is interesting because if you read a lot of the newspapers at the time, they still insisted on calling him Cassius Clay. And when you would hear white people talk about him, they would still call him Cassius Clay. And he was drafted, of course, and he immediately said that he was a conscientious objector and he was not going to go off and fight in what he considered a white man's war against other brown people. And he wanted nothing to do with it. And so they stripped him of his heavyweight title. And I can't remember. I don't think he was jailed, but there was certainly the threat that he was going to be in prison for a long time. They didn't allow him to fight. He didn't fight again until the early 70s. Mm-hmm. So he became, for a lot of the African American community, of course, he was rightly so a hero. He was a hero anyway because of his boxing career, but it's almost like he was along the same lines. In fact, he was exactly along the same lines as Dr. King and Malcolm X. He was suddenly not the good black guy anymore, right. Who he kept his mouth shut and did his boxing, just like they say about Kaepernick. Right. Well, if he would just keep his mouth shut and play football like he's supposed to, which is the most insanely racist thing you can say. Right. But,
it's as though your body's good enough for me to use for my entertainment, but I don't want to hear your voice in your struggles, right? And like that's such a conversation with African American athletes in general of their bodies are being used for white profit, right? Because when you look at who manages and who owns most athletic teams, it's not people of color. It is very much predominantly white. And so you are using my body for entertainment and for a cash payment, and you don't want to hear my voice. You don't want to fight my struggle. And the only athletic group I think that actually has made a real movement in saying, yes, we understand our role to play in this as not being people of color, but being employees of is the NBA, right? They have been very much okay with the fact that, yes, this is, we have to fight and stand behind this. And I want to go back to what Richard said about the not usage of Muhammad Ali's name, right? And that's not so, like, to us, it sounds crazy, but if you think about right now, our transgendered friends who have dead names and people still refusing to use their names and consistently still using their dead names, it's the same thing. It's a non-acceptance of the movement that someone wants to make forward for their life, right? It's almost parallel.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. And it's also the use of terms. So the idea of calling, the virus, calling it the China virus, mm-hmm. right? Versus, COVID-19 or whatever, like a technical term. Yeah.
Right. So it's so interesting to see so many things we can literally point at and be like, this is exactly what's happening, right? And it's that adage of like, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it or whatever. It's like, are we? Because we actually feel like it right now, right? This movement feels like we're repeating some stuff that we didn't have to if we just learned our lesson. But it also, when I think of Dr. King, I think about how we always talk about the I have a dream speech, right? Because it is a beautiful speech, right? And, the real story of it was he wasn't even intending to give that speech, but a Black woman of, friend said, no, tell him about the dream, right? So he actually was going to stand there and say something completely different until this woman was like, yeah, no, Martin, you need to bring up the ante, let's go. And so you think about that and you think about his other interviews, right? Like the other conversations that Dr. King has had that we don't talk about, right? Because it makes him a real person, right? It's no longer this, like, I have this great idea that everyone can feel like they can latch onto, right? Which I think is why we find so many people, at least I did, I know on social media, I find it funny when people I know were against Colin Kaepernick will post a Dr. King picture and it's like, my friend, they are the same, right? Like they are fighting it within the same realm. And why, if you can't support this one, you shouldn't be posting about this one, the other one.
Yeah. Wait, so if we're going to talk about memes too, I also want to talk about like how people don't understand, like not only do they not understand the history, but sometimes they're using this, like they're defending their ignorance, and they're, using this whole idea that, the world was only invented since the internet, so nothing really exists before that properly. So I came across a meme the other day on, I guess, Twitter or something, where somebody said, "I was not born to be forced. I will breathe after my own fashion," which is literally a quote from Henry David Thoreau, but he's using it as an excuse to not have to require people to wear masks in his gym. I will breathe after my own fashion. And I didn't want to start a Twitter war, but I was like, hey, do you realize that Henry died of tuberculosis?
Well, and
like he probably would have grabbed a mask if that could have helped.
Yeah, Henry's going to start wearing a mask. So and getting back to what we were saying about, Thoreau being the patron saint of civil disobedience, before he even went to jail for not paying his poll tax, Bronson Alcott, the father of Louisa May Alcott, did the same thing. He didn't pay his poll tax. So, but I think we kind of get this idea, at least people get this idea, that the only ones protesting in Massachusetts or Concord or Boston were just a bunch of white guys. Nikki, maybe you could talk a little bit about the Black presence in Concord and Boston in the years before the Civil War. I mean, obviously, there were way more Black abolitionists than there were white abolitionists.
Right, and we see that in the Garrison family, right? Susan and Ellen are part of an abolition slavery group, and they bring it to a church, and then they move to Boston and affect the Boston community with awareness of the fight for freedom for everyone and those enslaved. I think it's one of those things, right? Like we just realized it, right? That sometimes the voice of the people who don't have skin in the game are the ones that are being recognized. And sometimes that's a pro and a con. Like we watched Ellen grow up in Concord and be affected by racism in Concord, but then she also had classmates stand up for her and support her. And her mom realized, like, okay, there are people here that are going to listen to us and will help follow us and help in our mission to gain freedom for all. And so I think it's really interesting to even this day, we see people in the middle of Concord with Black Lives Matter, right? Signs. We see people with LGBTIA plus signs, right? That, the whole adage of in this house, love is love, right? And so, or newer adage, it's not that old. I feel like maybe it's newer, maybe it's older, whatever. It's around and I love it because it's true, right? Like, yeah. It doesn't matter. We believe in science, we believe in love, we believe everyone has a voice. And so that's still happening in the middle of Concord, right? When we have our 4th of July reading of Frederick Douglass, people are there to talk about that, to say, like, Frederick made this speech, but it's still relevant to right here in Concord right now, right? What does any of this mean? What does independence mean when others are enslaved, when that others are suffering? How can you celebrate freedom as a country when your country is kind of built on the idea that some of the people aren't real people, right? And so, and by real people, meaning people at all, right? And so every 4th of July, when we read that, there's always something that pops up to me that he says, and I'm like, that's a little too close to home. Like, that feels like he wrote that yesterday. And when I look at Ellen and fighting, when I reread her writing and she talks about being a teacher and like, I being a teacher as well, and the idea that all children are capable if you give them the tools to be successful, right? And I think that's what COVID kind of showed us more than ever, is that there's such an educational gap because we haven't provided kids with what they need, right? And when a kid has to go to a McDonald's parking lot to get Wi-Fi just so they can attend class, who are we as a country? Are we even having discussion about fair education, right? When we're looking at a time period where our schools are more segregated than before, the law came into effect. Again, we are not practicing policy versus reality. Like we're watching our kids suffer, and
can you go into Ellen Garrison's like educational career? Because I think that she was actually amazing.
Yeah. So, and Ellen was, I would probably be intimidated if I ever met her in class. She flew through her Concord textbooks. Every report from her, every class that she had was that she was flying through the books. She was finishing them before they were even halfway through for the rest of her class. And there's something admirable about that, because I think if Ellen wanted to be a doctor, she could have been a doctor. If she wanted to be a lawyer, she could have been a lawyer. If she wanted to be a farmer and agricultural developer, she could have done that too. She was highly intelligent, but she chose to be a teacher because she wanted to share that, right? That love of learning and the ability to be able to be successful because you know how to. And so when she left Concord and went to Baltimore, and, her purpose was, I want to give back to the Negro what I have. That's a sacrifice of self, right? Teaching is not easy. Anyone who's here, who listens or knows, if you're a teacher, it's hard, right? And so she wasn't teaching a classroom of, 12-year-olds all together on the same page. She was teaching 50-year-old people, 40-year-old people, 9-year-old people, all in one room. So to be able to get those people who are at all different spots of their lives to leave that room at the end of the year and feel like they could be successful, that's huge as an educator. I don't think I could do that, like, at all.
She was teaching freed men and women, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so
recently freed men and women.
Most probably not.
Yeah.
Wait, say that again. Nikki, say that last bit.
Some might have been able to read, but most likely probably not. And so you're really trying to catch people where they are. And she made it her mission, right? She was a great migration of her own, moving across the country and finding different places where the need for education stood, and she felt she could make an impact, right? And so to me, it's really great to see that her roots started in Concord, because it's almost like Concord was that soil for her of like, yeah, you can do this. You can hold this, like, help. And she did, right? She heard that call, and that's what she did until literally she died.
And she was very aware of what was going on in Concord with people like Thoreau and Emerson, and Frederick Douglass came to Concord a couple of times and lectured, and William Lloyd Garrison was always here, and Wendell Phillips and Lewis Hayden. I mean, every major abolitionist spent a lot of time in Concord. Yeah. And you can bet your bottom dollar that she was at every one of those lectures and every one of those gatherings. To listen to what these people had to say.
Right. Her and her mother.
Yeah. And right. I think she took power where she could, which was education.
Now, Nikki, could you talk a little bit about, was it when she was on a train and because of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, could you tell us that story? Because I think it's just an amazing story.
Yeah. So Ellen is coming back from teaching, and she decides, like, I'm going to challenge this, which I relate to so much. I love challenging things and authority. And so, I can just imagine her sitting there and saying, nope, today's the day. When I go back, I'm going to sit in the station where I want to sit because I have the right due to the Civil Rights Act. And her friend actually did it. They sat in one of the cars, and they were actually ended up being kicked out of that car because the officer said that they weren't allowed to be there, even though Ellen knew that she was allowed to be there. And so, rightfully so, she decided to sue the railroad company and say, yeah, no, I belong here. I think
and wait, was she actually expecting like a confrontation or expecting to be arrested, or was she thinking that because there's the law?
I think she was completely wholeheartedly ready. Just like, we sit and we talked about Rosa and like, oh, she just got up that morning and said, no, Rosa planned her outfit. Rosa sat in that seat on that day because she wanted to sit in that seat and she was ready for whatever happened to her. And I think Ellen probably did the same exact thing where she's like, I'm challenging this. Let's go, like, bring it. And to be able to say in that moment where you don't know, because I think right now to think about challenging authority, we all still feel a little safe. At that time when Ellen was challenging it, it wasn't a feeling of safety. Like, you really could have died and no one would have known what could have happened to you. I mean, it's just what it is at that time, sadly.
As a woman too, traveling.
And
United States history, especially during the Reconstruction era, is filled with stories of African Americans, newly freed African Americans, standing up to authority and being lynched and killed.
Right.
So the story of right. So her story could have ended just as badly.
And with no one knowing how or why, but just knowing that she was, right. And so I think she took a really big challenge, but it was worth it to her, right? And I know for me, like, I can say that to only a level, right? I have a little bit of self-preservation that I'm like, ooh, I have a kid I should raise, got a husband, got a family. Not sure how far I'm going to go there. But she didn't care. She did it, right? And so fast forward, she sues the company, and the end result is that they say they can't contact her in order for her case to go completely through. And so it went missing. But there was documentation that she filed it, and there was documentation that, she had a court date, but they couldn't serve her the papers to give her the court date. And so, again, one of those moments where practice, policy, not necessarily the same, but I think it was a huge step for her to be able to say, yeah, I challenged that, right? To be able to, not necessarily clout, but like to say, I can do this, right? It gave her a little bit more confidence in being able to challenge these places where often people weren't ready to do that. So I think that's amazing to say that she's a Concord resident who like walked the walk and talked the talk.
There is a lot of instances. So when Frederick Douglass was living in Lynn, Massachusetts, he would take the train to go on his lecture tours, and he would often sit in the white section. And there was more than one instance where he was physically thrown off the train because he refused to move. And there was an instance where they just undid the seat and threw the whole seat out of the train. And I'm sure that in her mind, I wonder if that sort of thing was flashing back in her mind when it happened to her, when they told her that she had to move. So although we've got these really amazing white guys in Concord, we've got people like the Garrisons and the Thoreau women and the Alcott girls and Mary Rice and Mary Merrick Brooks and all these other women who were standing up against the government. Because, William Lloyd Garrison himself said that the women were the backbone of the anti-slavery movement. And then you fast forward after the Civil War and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, a lot of these women then continued to fight for women's rights as well. So do we know if Ms. Garrison was involved in women's rights at all, or we just don't know?
No, I believe that she was. Like, there's a couple of documents that show that she was. Especially the vote. And so it's really interesting that that's where her mom, her mom is fighting for people to be able to make choice. And Ellen's like, I'm fighting for people to be educated enough to do that. And so both of their choices is really interesting to watch, as, she's clearly has watched her mom sit and talk with other women in the community and have these conversations about equity and assisting others in getting that. And then she chooses to educate so they can.
And we have a lot of her letters and her diaries. Is that correct?
A lot of her letters, all of her letters. Yeah.
Yeah. So for any budding scholars out there, they have been digitized, and don't assume that there's like a lack of resources, because it just sounds like a treasure trove.
It is. And it's great to actually also read them via her own handwriting, because you can see how pristine it was and how much care she took in writing, which we, as a society, handwriting, it's like, you don't have to really do that anymore. So,
and
Henry's handwriting was horrible as a teacher.
Right. Yeah. Thoreau's handwriting was terrible. Emerson's handwriting was okay. So, I find it interesting that her stuff is so legible.
Yeah.
I've seen some of her handwriting, and it's absolutely gorgeous. This might be a little off topic, but here's a woman who took great pride in her education, I think. And she wanted to show that off as much as she absolutely could. It doesn't matter to Thoreau and Emerson. I mean, they're Harvard graduates. They don't have to write pretty because it's Ralph Waldo Emerson.
It also reminds me just of the old school teacher, right? Like if you think about your primary school teachers, they all had beautiful handwriting, right? Like even today, when I look at my daughter's teacher's handwriting, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so unheard of anymore. Just like this beautiful handwriting.
Right. Which is almost like an act of defiance itself. An African-American woman, first who can read and write, that's pretty radical for mid-19th century America. I think there's a popular misconception that once the Civil War ended and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, everybody was pleased and everybody was happy. And we were all just one big happy black and white family and everything moved forward. But, I like to say that after the Civil War was over, then in some ways it was another war for the next 100 years for African Americans to even be considered equal, let alone be treated as equals. The Civil War ended in 1865. When did President Johnson, when did LBJ sign the Civil Rights Act? Was that 1965? I think.
Right, like 100 years later?
64, yeah. It was 100 years later that Civil Rights Act was finally signed. So the Civil War
and also like all of 2020 has shown us how, unequal everything still is. Right. Unfortunately, we've seen all the killings of people, not like in the guise of arrest, or the police are chasing down people who they believe are violent, but when you actually discover the circumstances, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, like how are these issues still, horrible incidents, how are they still happening? And how come the justice system hasn't developed something to make up for that? And why is it that, I'm comparing like the arrest of Henry Thoreau, where Sam is like, I'll take care of your tax for you. This is just a formality. And Henry's like, no, you actually have to arrest me, versus people who get chased down the street and shot at and killed for minor, like not even infractions, for literally existing
in their homes, right? Like
in their homes.
Well, and I always talk with people like, well, we're such a free society. It's like, well, we wouldn't need almost 4 civil rights acts if we were that free, right? Like, wouldn't need that. Someone's got to hold accountability, right? And I think it's 2 parts. Like we are looking right now at a really scary fact that people who can control for the next couple of weeks what is happening education-wise are saying that they don't want the true story of America told, right? Like they'll actually not give funding if you have any anti-racist, anti-bias work done in your corporations, right? And so no one's asking, for lack of a better way, no one's asking why is that happening? No one's saying why wouldn't you want us to become whole, right? And so where does that leave us, right? Because there's still just such a divide. And I honestly do believe it's because people don't really understand the history of this country. And there's that small portion, right? And then there's a portion who do, and it's just so ugly they can't digest it, right? Yeah. And that's hard.
Even talking about a lot of the radicals that I hold near and dear to my heart are virtually unknown by the American people. And let's face it, even Henry Thoreau is still pretty unknown by a lot of people. And if they know him, they just know him as the guy who lived at Walden Pond. They're totally unaware that he was involved with the Underground Railroad. They might be aware that he went to jail, but they're not really sure about it. And there's so many people, black and white, male and female, like Lewis Hayden, who and the Grimke sisters and Ellen Craft and all of these abolitionists and later suffragettes or suffragists who, like Lucy Stone, who fought and fought and fought their entire lives, who are still virtually unknown by the American public, and so I like to think that when we talk about these people, when we talk about Sojourner Truth, I think, why don't we take down the statues of Robert E. Lee and put up statues of Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Dr. King and all these other people. We're not rewriting history. We're correcting history that was rewritten.
Yeah, and it's not just telling the full portrait of history, right? And that's always the problem, is that people see it as like history is this, right? When actually history is like this, and then a little bit of that, and like a lot of sprinkles. Like there's so many parts to history, right? And we would never have enough time, right? Like when you think about the 1619 Project and how the Atlantic slammed it, right? But it's like, how long did you want that to be? It's like some things have to be omitted, right? Some things just can't get added in. But it's making the effort to show as many points of view as possible. And I think, I think about the history books I had, there was a tiny little picture for the people of color, and that was it. Yeah. Right? Unless you did your own research, that's all you got. So, as an educator, I always tell people, teach the little box, because that's the box that actually matters right now, because it's clearly not being taught throughout this entire lengthy portion.
Because we haven't even, on at least this week on this episode, we haven't even gotten into Native American history. And that's
I know. I keep trying to shoehorn everything in. Like the Mexican-American War is something, but that's also about Native people and Spanish people who had invaded them. So, it's history is this ongoing thing. And actually, so you guys, because you guys have set it up so nicely, I'm actually just going to introduce a Facebook group that I've literally just started called Transcendentalist 2021. You can look it up on Facebook, and it's totally free. Like, it's just going to be a reading list and a place where we can discuss and bring up a lot of the people that Richard's mentioning. And Nikki, I hope, is also going to help me on gathering the reading list, just looking it over, just making sure that we mention all these people who deserve to have their stories told, and people who actually did a lot of good work. Anybody else who does social media, and as we develop this further, I want us to all connect on social media and have a place to discuss it, because especially during COVID and beyond, I want us to have an online community where we can start to really go through a lot of these readings and histories and biographies and really start to make them known and take them seriously.
So before we wrap up, Nikki, maybe you should give us some information about where we can find information about the Robbins House and other places like that you think that our viewers should be aware of.
Sure. So our website has a load of information, and we were very lucky to have Concord help us videotape a few things as well. So there's some YouTube videos as well about Ellen, her family, about the house. You can actually find or watch a video of the house being moved from its original location to where it is now, which is across the street from Old Manse, which I find interesting because I'm like, how do you do that? Like, you just lift up a house? Okay, cool. Let's watch that happen. And, we are really hopeful that this spring we'll be able to open a little earlier. So if we are safe as a community, as a country, always feel free to stop by the house. We always have an interpreter there to help you and guide you. And then our 4th of July reading, we always have. So this year we did it a little bit differently virtually, but fingers crossed, July 4th, we can all be back in person to read Frederick Douglass together. And so, take a look on our website, and there's some great links there. And you can actually see a picture of Ellen's handwriting as well. So if you want to see some amazing, beautiful cursive writing, there it is.
What's the website?
And it's therobinshouse.org.
Great.
Awesome. Cool. So as always, thanks to our speakers, thanks to the people who are having this conversation, thanks to all of you who are watching, thanks to Mustard Seed Productions and Many Moons, and thanks to Minuteman Media Network for helping us produce this whole thing. We'll see you next time. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.